Coming up, Lisa Vetten, researcher at the University of South Africa, speaks to us about load shedding and the possibility of social unrest. Professor Anne von Gottberg, a clinical microbiologist at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, speaks on diphtheria and other outbreaks. A very good afternoon if you just joined us, coming to you live from our studios in Johannesburg. Welcome to Week in Review, the program where we review some of the big stories to come out of the week, what has been making headlines and getting South Africans talking. I'm your host, Asanda Magaqa. President Cyril Ramaphosa has reassured residents of the Cape Winelands district that load shedding would be reduced by the end of the year. But he has also cautioned South Africans to brace themselves for a difficult winter season ahead. This comes after Eskom warned the nation that Stage 8 could not be ruled out in the winter months if its interventions to decrease load shedding are not effective. Ramaphosa made these remarks on the sidelines of the 6th presidential Imbizo in the Western Cape. SABC News Politics reporter Natasha Pili filed this report.
Communities of the Cape Winelands district raising their grievances at the doorstep of government. But outside, a small group going by the name of Voice of the Excluded vented their frustration.
Asiphangeli, ii-clinics zethu ziyashota ngestaff, i-youth ayiphangeli, that's why i-crime inyuke kangaka. So sadecide into yoba kungcono simlinde apha ngaphandle.
The bones of contention for many are unemployment, service delivery, substance abuse, crime, housing and land eviction, amongst other issues. Ramaphosa promised swift action from his executive, working with the provincial and local government. Another commitment he made was to reduce load shedding.
Within the next few months, and yes, within the year, we will have brought load shedding down quite significantly.
But the country's first citizen conceded that the coming months would be a difficult time for South Africans, as the ailing power utility had said that the country might be plunged into Stage 8 load shedding during winter.
We are going to have a difficult winter, and we are addressing the challenge of load shedding. And that is why I appointed a Minister of Electricity, as I said, who's working on this matter day in and day out, every hour of the day. And we are going to have ups and downs with regards to load shedding because our generation units are old and they keep breaking up, and they are being repaired and we are maintaining them. And the renewable generation is coming into its own. So whilst we are going to have a difficult winter, but we are going to address load shedding.
Meanwhile, the president weighed in on the commission of inquiry into the alleged supply of weapons to Russia, saying that it is making headway.
We are finalizing all that, and we will make all the necessary announcements in due course, in fact, shortly. And the timeline is a very tight and short timeline because we want to address this matter.
The national and provincial government have committed to making service delivery a priority following the Imbizo, with the Western Cape government having expressed its determination to have certain national powers devolved to it and assert its independence. It raises the question of how well the collaboration of the district development model will work in this context.
Now that the community has had their say, the onus is now upon government to ensure that they deliver on their promises. Natasha Piri, SABC News, Paarl in the Western Cape.
It's been a week marked by bittersweet moments for former Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter. His controversial book about the goings-on at the power utility was launched. But it was also a week in which he received lashings from both his former employer and the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan. As if that was not enough, the ANC revealed that it was in the process of serving him with summons.
Gordhan appeared before Parliament's public accounts watchdog body, SCOPA, over Direte's allegations of endemic corruption at the power utility. Gordhan's appearance followed that of Direte, Eskom board, law enforcement agencies, as well as the former board chairperson earlier. The Public Enterprises Minister was seen as key in shedding more light on Direte's allegations, especially on the names of the politicians implicated in graft at the power utility. However, Gordhan also refused to name names.
But I have to emphasize, I'm not here on trial. So you can ask me to help you to clarify certain things, but I want to be quite emphatic that I've done nothing wrong that I have to explain myself on. And the culprits who have done something wrong can come here and account for themselves.
Gordhan didn't mince his words about Direte's performance at the power utility.
What is it that you did to ensure better maintenance, higher quality of operators, and to make sure that if plan A failed, there was a plan B that you were open to listen to? So what is singularly lacking, and has been lacking, is a simple thing called humility. And all of us require it from time to time, whatever level of arrogance we might have assumed about ourselves. Because if you don't have humility, you don't have the ability to listen.
MPs had different views about the former CEO.
Has he produced an exit report as a man who has left that institution? And what are the elements of that exit report as a man who has been employed in that institution to execute certain functions and duties?
Which is to always shoot the messenger. I mean, we see it again and again and again. And in this particular case, one's now hearing, oh, well, you know, the previous CEO didn't do this or he didn't do that, or he had a confidentiality agreement, maybe he should have done it differently. To a certain extent, that is really irrelevant to where we are now.
Gordhan also refuted allegations that he was micromanaging, but was quick to say he was not shy to ask tough questions when things aren't going right.
Absolute nonsense. There's no micromanaging. I think here what we have is a CEO who thought he was know-all, and he certainly hadn't worked in a power station situation before. So I refute any assertion and allegation about giving instructions.
Gordhan says other multinational companies have also made Eskom its cash cow.
Eskom is not just a feeding trough for the ANC, as the former CEO alleges. There have been instances where there's been a link, and one can't deny that, between institutions like Chancellor House and some of the projects that have been undertaken. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that multinational institutions like ABB, SAP, local companies like Trillion.
Meanwhile, the ANC revealed this week that it's still pursuing Direte legally.
I have applied in the High Court, which I've won, for a citation which has been granted to the African National Congress. I'm serving in papers in that Hamburg. They are on their way to Hamburg. So that is what is going to happen. So, because to take him on, we don't want his money. He must say, this is what is happening. Are the things I'm saying why the ANC is corrupt. And these are the individuals.
Scopa is yet to take a decision whether or not to conduct a full inquiry into Direte's allegations. Lula Magaqa, SABC News, Parliament.
Forestry, Fisheries and Environment Minister Barbara Creecy has declined to comment on the developments regarding Karpowership, saying it would compromise her role as the appeal authority on the matter. This follows the news that the Transport Department has approved Turkish company Karpowership's application to access the ports of Muga, Richards Bay and Saldanha Bay for the next 20 years. Karpowership intends to generate power on its floating gas ship and feed it into South Africa's electricity grid, but the deal is facing opposition from environmental groups.
The decision to grant Karpowership access to South Africa's ports before it's even secured environmental authorization is shocking.
Wading into muddy waters, the Transport Department's announcement on its approval of port docking for 3 of Karpowership's vessels has landed them square in the storm of controversy, with environmental groups demanding answers.
And the fact that this was decided on the 26th of February yet never publicly disclosed is ludicrous. The fossil fuel industry thrives off of deception, and it thrives also off of secrecy. And in this instance, they're using our power crisis and our desperation for access to energy to lock us into a project that'll be bad for the economy.
If you look at the small print, it says that, in fact, this is not a decision to go ahead. This is simply to say that providing all the necessary approvals are in place, they will be able to moor at the port. So far, the environmental approvals have failed, not once, but in terms of Kuka also twice. And the generation license is also under review.
In a written statement, the Transport Minister says the approval is in line with the National Ports Act number 12 of 2005, which gives the Transport Ministry powers to approve such applications. However, the approval depends on whether Karpowership will get concurrent approvals from the Department of Environment and Energy Regulator, NERSA. Environment Minister Barbara Creasy was cagey to respond.
Linda, I have indicated to you that I'm the appeal authority, and I don't wish to discuss this matter in this meeting because it compromises my ability to be objective. The question of the costs is a matter which would rest in the domain of Minister Mantashe.
Creasy said all processes would be done in a fair manner.
There is a mitigation hierarchy, which is what the environmental impact assessment represents. That environmental impact assessment is managed in an objective manner, no matter who is the applicant. I think the concerns that Cabinet would have, and this is why I would have spoken about our attempts to cut red tape, that would be the concern that Cabinet would have.
Environmental groups say the lack of transparency around the Karpowership issue is concerning.
We are still a very, very long way away from these power ships generating any electricity to help us with our energy crisis in South Africa. This move and clarification from the Department of Transport seems indicative of the way that Karpowership and government have been acting around this whole debacle in trying to bring Karpowerships to South Africa.
Karpowership has been mired in controversy since it was announced as the preferred bidder in March 2021 to supply 1,220 megawatts of electricity to the national grid for 20 years at an estimated cost of 200 billion rand. SABC News reached out to both the Transport Ministry and the Department of Minerals and Energy for a response. Nozintombi Mia, SABC News.
Welcome back. Baldwin Properties has successfully interdicted some residents of the developer's recently opened Munyaka Lifestyle Estate after they staged a protest and blocked entrances over, amongst other things, power outages. Frustrated protesters this week stopped contractors and employees from entering the JSE-listed company's luxury apartments in the Waterfall City precinct. In court documents, the company said the chaos began because of several days of power outages at Munyaka caused by an Eskom cable fault, but residents say there are long-standing issues. Meanwhile, Minister in the Presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshabeni, says high levels of load shedding are making communities and civil society at large susceptible to mobilization against government by elements with nefarious agendas. She listed load shedding, unemployment, crime and corruption as national security risks when she debated the State Security Agency's budget in the National Assembly. We're now joined by Lisa Vetten, researcher at the University of South Africa on gendered violence and urban transformations. Lisa, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the Week in Review. Is load shedding and touted possible blackouts now considered a national security risk in your view?
Yes, they certainly do. They certainly increase people's feelings of being very unsafe, and they also expose people to risks of different kinds of crime, whether that be rape, domestic violence, or robberies and break-ins. So they most certainly do contribute, and they certainly do contribute to the souring of the national mood, I would say, in relation to how optimistic people feel about the future of not only themselves and their families, but also the country.
People feeling unsafe, it's certainly a very real perception, and although we don't have the crime statistics currently to back that up, it is unavoidable, undeniable that if we're going to be driving down a dark street in the middle of load shedding, and if your house is going to be in complete darkness, it is a situation that criminals and those with nefarious agendas are going to take advantage of. Now, how is this going to possibly lend itself to an instance like the social unrest we saw in July 2021?
Well, we have seen some reports, for example, of housebreakers and robbers timing their actions for when, according to the load shedding schedule. So they will, of course, know in advance when an area may be, if generators aren't available or security cameras are not working, what time will be optimal for them to break in with minimal interruption, for instance. I've also been involved personally in a case where 2 security guards, for example, were sent to guard a cemetery where there were no lights working, and they were both raped at gunpoint. That's an example, I think, also of an employer failing to ensure that somebody's safety is being secured at the time they work. So I think there are a range of different complexities here that we need to take into account. I mean, I think there are also situations, for example, where the added stress that comes from load shedding may increase household conflict and thus increase possibly the likelihood of domestic violence occurring. So there are a range of different ways in which load shedding can impact on people's safety. I think also it just increases, for anybody who has had a previous experience of violence, sitting alone in the dark without knowing you can call backups, your cell phone may not be working to call the police, can only aggravate and reactivate old feelings of trauma and fear and anxiety. So, it's not just the actual likelihood of violence happening, it's what it does to bring back memories of prior violence that can also contribute to people's feelings of insecurity.
Trauma, stress, anxiety, all these talk to mental health issues, Lisa, and it's not imagined, it is very real. Now, we talked about the possibilities of social unrest. Now, how does this state of mind, the state of emotions, state of mental health going to somehow lend itself? Because we've already heard even last week that there were suggestions that even the governing party members want to protest against load shedding. And we've already seen other protest action, including the economic freedom fighters. Now, let's talk broadly around social unrest. The likelihood of what we're going to see happening, because we're already saying that people are stressed. We saw at Munyaga people blockading entrances of their residencies. What are we looking at exactly?
That should be hard to predict, but I think we've seen in other countries where there have been sustained periods of power outages. I mean, I'm thinking of Venezuela, for instance, where you did see an increase in looting, for example. People, they're in a context where perhaps have lost their jobs, or their jobs have become very uncertain due to load shedding. Their anger may well spill over, and so they may protest out of anger, but they may also be opportunistic in terms of if they haven't had jobs and money to obtain food, they may then go and loot instead, especially if there is no security at any particular kind of place. It may also be that once again people will target vulnerable populations in South Africa, like those who are perhaps not South African citizens. So the risks do seem to be real, and we have seen increased examples of looting in other countries where there have been extended periods of power outage. So I think we are right to be concerned and worried and to start thinking proactively, not to just, I think, say these are the risks and leave it at that, but to actually think very proactively around what are our alternative plans in this situation.
Lisa, you've led me to a broader discussion around the economic, stage and the economic depression that people are experiencing. But let's move on to what we saw public enterprises do at Scopa earlier this week. The Minister, Pravin Gordhan, when asked about the alleged corruption at Eskom, did he use the moment well to reassure the public that it's in good hands amidst this energy crisis?
I don't think the ruling party has really distinguished itself or its employees in cabinet around how they've dealt with the crisis. There's been too much, I think, finger-pointing, shifting of blame elsewhere, finding fault, without, I think, any clear idea of we are going to be of practical options, such as, for instance, we may be installing solar to be used at robots, for example, which will help limit opportunities for smash and grab, or will help keep things flowing, or we're going to be installing solar in communities. There just hasn't been the kind of leadership or the kind of thinking that suggests we are taking proactive steps instead of just being angry and blaming others.
And we saw scenes at Megawatt Park yesterday when residents of particularly Baklu throwing their rotten food on the street. That talks to food security, Now, the economy is suffering as a result of all of this. Businesses are failing, Lisa. Households are complaining and throwing food on the street at Megawatt Park. Do we have a clear picture of how badly South Africans are being impacted?
I think there's enough. We're hearing every day how communities, how companies, how businesses, small businesses as well, are being affected. I mean, Eskom has just recently distributed a document, for example, around what might happen if the national grid collapses. And I think for me, what is extremely concerning is that document said there is no national plan in place should the grid collapse. That is deeply concerning. It does not suggest that government has a good grip on what they will do, on what their plans are in a worst-case scenario. That may be very unlikely, but it's clear that we've already had neighbourhoods who had days without electricity. Where are the plans?
Lisa Vetten is a researcher at the University of South Africa on gendered violence and urban transformations. At the same time, earlier this week, close to 20 regional trade unions met in Johannesburg for a regional policy meeting on trade union-led strategies for a public pathway approach to a just energy transition. Leaders in attendance included representatives of 8 national workers' centres, 2 global union federations and 4 allied research centres, representing a total of 15 countries. For more on this, we're now joined by SACP's Dr. Alex Mashilo. A very good afternoon to you, Dr. Mashilo. Let us talk about how the gathering went this past week. Dr. Mashilo, can you hear me? We expect to be in dialogue with Dr. Alex Mashilo, who is from the South African Communist Party. And while
yes, I can hear you now.
Great stuff, Dr. Mashile. Let's go back to the dialogue that transpired this past week. We're talking about the potential for growing social unrest over the energy crisis. Is this one of the issues that the unions deliberated on in this past week?
No, the main objective of the meeting, sponsored by trade unions for energy security, which was not really a South African meeting, but was a sub-Saharan Africa meeting, to look at the problem of energy poverty, climate change.
Dr. Mashilo, as you maybe delve more into who are the participants who were present at that meeting, talk to us about the public pathway approach to a just energy transition in the Global South.
No, the public pathway approach to a just energy transition is concerned with building democratic control and social ownership of energy. What we understand has come out from the meeting from our allies, COSATU, is that at its conclusion, the meeting produced a letter to the World Bank Group, which we believe should be shared with the International Monetary Fund, as the Union are opposed to the neoliberal co-option of the concept of just energy transition, which originates from the trade union movement. But these global institutions and others like the World Economic Forum have co-opted the concept to advance a neoliberal pathway to what they call just energy transition partnerships. If you look at the countries that have been trapped into the pathway promoted by those institutions, those countries are locked into loans. If, for example, your requirement to advance the just energy transition is, for argument's sake, 100 rand, they will give you a loan of about 1 rand with interest rate but tied to the pathway that they want. And in that way, these institutions stand in the way of the real just energy transition as they drive private ownership of energy, and in the process will lock out many people because private ownership of energy can only be underpinned by profit-making investment, which is why as the SACP we agree with the trade union centers from South Africa and from sub-Saharan Africa who are forming part of the trade unions for energy democracy in campaigning for democratic and social ownership of energy to resolve the problems of energy poverty, to address the problems of climate change, and to respond to private sector attacks on workers and workers' rights.
Allegations of corruption and money taken from state coffers, Dr. Mashilo, are they making it impossible for developmental governance?
Of course, not necessarily the allegations per se, but the actual conduct of corruption is a major cause for concern, not only for trade unions, but also for organizations like the South African Communist Party and other organizations that do mean it when they say that they are opposed to corruption. You can see for yourself in South Africa what has happened now. We are facing load shedding as a result not only of neoliberal policies, but also of corruption. And if it was not of corruption, which has become a counter-revolutionary tendency, it is likely that our situation would be better than we are right now.
There has been a groundswell from civil society, from members of the public organizations, non-governmental organizations, and yet South Africa is experiencing various government departments communicating different things on the same thing. Is there really any evidence of cooperative governance?
No, there are problems. Look at the week that was. The Minister of Electricity, Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, came out to say that South Africa is not opposed to powerships. He said that for so long as that will not exceed a period of 5 years, because in his assessment, South Africa should make more progress to address energy generation under capacity within 5 years, meaning that in the period of 5 years afterwards, to be specific, we may not necessarily need interventions such as powerships. But a day after that, we saw Karpowership South Africa publish on its website information that it has been granted about 20-year access to 3 major ports in South Africa. And it appears, as it comes out from that statement, that came from a contract that was conceived by the Department of Minerals and Energy. It is quite important for government to be seen acting as a single unit and to ensure that it communicates a single message, but that requires common action from within the government, because when one minister says something, another minister says another, and the president says something else, that becomes a problem of leadership to society, especially when you are managing a crisis.
And what would be the South African Communist Party's advice specifically on these multi-messages from various governments, all seemingly communicating different things?
No, the multiple messages do not have a problem per se. What is a problem is the contradictions when one communicates in a direction that we need to absorb as the public, and another brings a different direction. The South African Communist Party will be holding a bilateral session on Monday with the leadership of the African National Congress at a political leadership level outside of the government. And one of the items on the agenda is the state of the National Democratic Revolution, which is our shared strategy. And when we look at the state of the National Democratic Revolution, we will certainly include the energy crisis, because from where we stand as the SACP, it is a threat to the National Democratic Revolution, and the multiple and contradictory messages coming out of the government are just causing confusion in society. That we will recommend humbly so to the leadership of the African National Congress and of course of the government to consider bringing that to an end. If it is necessary, it would be advisable for government leaders to make use of speakers' notes, to speak from the same hymn sheet in giving leadership, because government leaders contradicting one another just causes confusion, and that confusion includes a lack of trust in what the government leaders are saying. That at the moment is really not needed, given the crisis that we are faced with.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alex Mashilo from the South African Communist Party. We'll certainly be looking at the outcomes of that bilateral meeting that is going to be taking place, according to Dr. Mashilo, on Monday between the SACP and the ruling party. Dr. Nandi Magudumana has filed an urgent application for the Free State High Court to declare her arrest in Tanzania and deportation to South Africa unlawful. Magudumana was arrested on 7 April 2023 alongside escaped convicted murderer and rapist Thabo Bester in Arusha. Bester escaped from the Mangaung Correctional Center in Bloemfontein in May last year in a staged suicide which allegedly involved assistance from employees of the facility. Magudumana, who's facing charges that include aiding and abetting a convicted criminal, also wants the court to nullify the criminal charges brought against her and that she be immediately discharged from arrest. The matter will be heard by the High Court in Bloemfontein on Thursday, the 25th of May. Health Minister Dr. Joe Phaahla is advising South Africans to be calm but vigilant after South Africa recorded 2 positive cases of diphtheria disease. The National Institute for Communicable Diseases has alerted the Department of Health of 2 laboratory-confirmed cases of diphtheria that were detected in April. Diphtheria is an uncommon but vaccine-preventable serious infection caused by a toxin-producing bacterium called Corynebacterium diphtheria. We're joined now by Professor Anne van Gotberg, clinical microbiologist at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. A very good afternoon to you, Prof, and thank you so much for joining us on the Week in Review. How many cases are now confirmed?
Only 2. So we've had 2 symptomatic cases and 1 asymptomatic carrier was confirmed. But that's all we've had this year.
Is the outbreak uncommon because of the high levels of vaccination or the season or both?
Mostly because of the high levels of vaccination. And we think it's an infant vaccine, so it's given to infants at 6, 10, and 14 weeks, and then there are boosters, 3 boosters in young children. And we believe that there might be a gap that children didn't receive all their vaccines during the pandemic. And that's what we are trying to advise parents and guardians to please make sure that their children, their infants are vaccinated. So when they're due for vaccination, but also to ensure that older children that might have missed vaccines, that they go for catch-up vaccines.
Now we have one case in a child, one case in an adult. How does diphtheria manifest and what should people look out for?
So it's a respiratory infection, an upper respiratory tract infection, and it presents with fever, a sore throat, and weakness. And very importantly, the neck and the throat swell. And so often that's described as a bull neck. And unfortunately, as a result of the swelling, the respiratory airway becomes obstructive and it's very difficult to breathe. And this is what the cases that presented with and what we need to look out for. But most importantly, I think we want to advise clinicians, nurses, anyone working in the healthcare sector at clinics and hospitals to remember this diagnosis as part of the differential diagnosis when individuals present to casualty or to the clinic.
All right. And now, if I am sitting here, Prof, and I am experiencing those symptoms, how do I go about treating it and also ensuring that it is not part of this outbreak?
So it would be so severe that you would need to go to a doctor, a clinic or hospital, which is really important. I think the severity of it would be noticeable. And what we need to make sure of is that people know which clinic and can access clinics, GPs, doctors. And then the doctors will need to treat because, in fact, it needs very specific treatment. It needs an antitoxin and antibiotics. So we can't treat it at home. We need to really be in a clinic, hospital, and then they'll work together with the Department of Health because it's a notifiable condition. They will work together to make sure that the individual gets adequate treatment.
I asked that question, Prof, because we have heard as well that we are witnessing a return of COVID and people are registering a lot of the symptoms that now we are hearing that can also be part or symptoms that are similar to diphtheria, and that is really what we're trying to do for public awareness. If I'm sitting here and I'm experiencing the same symptoms, mindful that there's COVID as well, that we're hearing that there is a return to, what is it that as members of the public should be doing to ensure that we remain vigilant, not only against COVID, but also any other disease that might be coming forward at this point?
And you're absolutely right. It's the beginning of winter, and we know that we're detecting influenza cases, respiratory syncytial virus cases. So respiratory viruses are being detected. And the most important things individuals need to worry about is to monitor their symptoms. If they think this is a mild cough, a mild cold that they have, then to do what we've advised everyone to do is to remain at home, to socially distance so that you don't spread your viruses, to stay rehydrated and to rest. As soon as you start thinking, and it's becoming more severe and it's unusual, parents, when they notice that their children can't breathe that easily, they're becoming breathing fast and being uncomfortable. If there's a weakness, if there's something unusual. So you really need to, you'll notice that there's something more severe. And even for those respiratory viruses, so not even only for diphtheria, but for respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, for influenza, it's very important for us to remember the danger signs, to remember when it's getting severe. And for all of these infections, we should be presenting to clinical practitioners, to the clinic and hospital, so it can be managed properly.
Recently, Prof, the Department of Health reported that some vaccines for COVID were not being used, people simply not going in for their booster shots. We also know that just prior to the beginning of the winter season, we are always urged to go for the vaccines for influenza. And earlier on, you were talking about diphtheria and that the vaccines are given to a child, or rather in the early stages of one's life. And if parents maybe skipped one, they should be vigilant in ensuring that kids are taken back to get their vaccines. What should we do now in light of all the vaccines that are currently available, and perhaps that now some of us are already suffering from influenza and all kinds of respiratory diseases? Is this the time that at the beginning of winter we should also be vigilant and ensure that we go and present ourselves for the available vaccines?
Absolutely. I think there's been communications going out. Please, people should present for influenza vaccines. This is definitely the time it's been for the last month to really come forward to get the vaccines. If you are ill and it may or may not be influenza, just to wait until you're better, until the symptoms are over, and then go. There are still vaccines available, influenza vaccines, to go present and to be vaccinated. You can have more than one infection in a season. It can do you no harm, and it's really important to try and protect as much of individuals as possible from these respiratory illnesses.
Well, I'm due for a second booster shot, Prof, and I will certainly go and get the additional one. Thank you very much for joining us on the Week in Review. Professor Anne von Gottberg is from the Institute for Communicable Diseases. Welcome back. Voter apathy amongst the youth remains low in South Africa, with 35% of the youth registered to vote. In Mpumalanga, only 15% of the youth are registered to vote in the upcoming provincial and national election. Lack of trust, service delivery, and unemployment are just some of the issues raised by young people. The Independent Electoral Commission has launched the Tertiary Institution campaign to encourage the youth to register.
The 2024 election nearing close, and the country has a fast-growing youth population. But more and more of these young people are not participating in the elections. But why?
I don't see the value of voting because there is no change, like load shedding, and there are a lot of people homeless, and people are still fighting for free education.
I don't think voting has made any difference because, graduates are coming from school, still don't have jobs, the load shedding.
Voting is a fundamental legal and democratic right for those 18 years and above.
I see there's a lot of corruption that's happening, and as youth we are not entertaining to those things, so we want to fight. So I want to just to choose a best or a politics because now we are failing as South Africa.
I decided to register to vote this year because it is important to vote because of the benefit that we get as students.
The IEC want to increase youth voter registration by promoting voter education with campaigns at tertiary institutions.
We know that we're going for elections next year, so if they have not registered, then it will be difficult for them to vote. So we are far much behind in the province, as we know that we're almost sitting at 35% of the youth in the whole population of the country. So we are almost less around, if not mistaken, 15% of the youth that is registered in the province. So we're running this campaign. Most of the youth that we have spoken to, they have indicated that they are not sure why they should vote. What is it that they are going to benefit when they vote? So today we're out here to teach them and to make them understand the importance of voting.
Those eligible to vote are encouraged to register on the IEC website or the nearest office. Dumela Machogo, SABC News, Nkomazi.
Former Tourism Minister Lindiwe Sisulu has promised to take care of the family of late struggle stalwart and ambassador to Algeria, Billy Masetlha. Sisulu was speaking at the ambassador's funeral service at the Methodist Church in Bryanston, north of Johannesburg. Masetlha died at the age of 68 a week ago following a long illness. Former Minister Sisulu shared fond memories of the life of the late struggle stalwart and also highlighted how Masetlha suffered.
I was Billy's minister when I was Minister of Intelligence. And I'd never been so proud in my life, because all the people who worked around me were from the same stable, loved the country, were prepared to die for the country. But the worst thing happened to me. They wake me up one night and they say, all three of us have been fired. And I said, no, it must be a nightmare. They said, yes, all three of us have been fired. So I thought, okay, fine, let's go and plead our case. And we did try to plead our case, but unfortunately all three of them were dismissed. I could not believe this, because here were three of the most passionate people I've ever worked with, some of the most trusted in our community. However, I'm fast forwarding. It did seem that Billy's particular penchant for making sure that things go right did not go well with most of the people who were with him. Billy became a DG of Home Affairs. And what he didn't know is that the real DG in Home Affairs was not him, but the special advisor to the minister, Buthelezi. So it looked like he was overstepping his mark and taking decisions that former ministers as legal advisor Ambrosini would have preferred. So he was stripped of his constitutional responsibility as a DG. It was the first time in our history that we realized that our constitution does allow a minister to strip a DG of his responsibility. I didn't do it to mine, which is why some of them are still here. But Billy just happened to walk in that unfortunate path all his life. And he suffered this with such grace. He bore no grudges to anybody. He just said, it's part of my lot, and I'll take it on. By the time Billy, about 10 years ago, was working from Lutuli House, you could see how most of these experiences had drained him. And he bore it with such fortitude, because it was Billy. And because he loved all of you so much, he was willing to take all the pain that he went through. Billy went through a lot of pain for us all to be here together today.
Now, going back to the courts, the Durban High Court has acquitted brothers Dylan and Ned Govender of the murder of Mondli Majola in Phoenix in Durban during the 2021 July riots. However, they were found guilty of attempted murder, assault with the intent to do grievous bodily harm, and common assault. A third accused in the matter, Jitendra Jaikinsoon, died in police custody in October 2021.
Phoenix, where 37 people were killed, became a hotspot for racial tensions during the 2021 July civil unrest. 19-year-old Mondli Majola, a matric learner, was the victim of a brutal killing. In what was described as a racially motivated attack, Majola and three of his friends were set upon by a mob of Phoenix residents. The state said Majola died from gunshot wounds. Majola's friends, in testimony, placed the Govender brothers at the center of the killing, and they identified Dylan Govender as the one who pulled the trigger. During the bail hearing, the police disputed that Majola had died from a stab wound, as the post-mortem found. A second post-mortem, however, found that Majola had died from gunshot wounds, but that he also had a stab wound. CCTV footage of the attack and the shooting was central to the case. The footage showed an unidentified man who was never arrested stabbing Majola. Dylan Govender was seen pointing a firearm at Majola, who fell to the ground, and Ned Govender was seen assaulting Majola after he was shot. Handing down judgment, Judge Gregory Kruger said that the state failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the brothers killed Majola. He also criticized the police for not arresting the unidentified man seen in the footage stabbing Majola. Judge Kruger rejected the Governor's testimony, describing it as nothing but lies which could not be relied upon. The court then postponed the matter to the 5th of July for sentencing. Bail has been extended until then. The Majola family members were not in court. Vusi Kumalo, SABC News, Durban.
And that is where we leave it for this week. Thank you very much for tuning in. Until next time, have a wonderful afternoon further.